Part 1. The Perfect Pack. A monster does not always hide in the dark shadows of a cold closet. Sometimes, the most dangerous creature sleeps right next to you, gently petting your favorite dog. I did not know this absolute truth until my perfect world completely shattered. My name is Sarah, and I survived a beautiful nightmare. My husband, David, was the kindest, most gentle man I had ever known. His heart was full of pure, unconditional love. We shared a wonderful, peaceful life in a small house near the quiet woods. Our greatest joy was our rescue dog, a beautiful golden retriever named Max. Max was not just a pet to us. He was our loyal, sensitive, and deeply traumatized furry child. David spent countless hours patiently healing Max from his dark, abusive past. He understood canine psychology perfectly. The bond between David and Max was incredibly strong and beautiful to watch. Our small family felt completely perfect and perfectly safe. We were a happy pack, deeply connected by trust and pure love. The house was always filled with warm sunlight and the happy sound of Max wagging his tail. I truly believed our beautiful happiness would last for an entire lifetime. But the dark shadows crept into our home very slowly. The terrifying change did not happen overnight. It started with small, strange details that I tried to ignore. David began to act differently. He looked exhausted all the time, and a dark, heavy shadow lived deep inside his eyes. One quiet evening, we were watching television in the living room. Max walked over and rested his soft chin heavily on David's leg, just like he always did. It was a normal, sweet gesture of pure love. I smiled, expecting David to gently scratch behind the dog's ears. Instead, a sudden, terrifying sound filled the room. David growled. It was a deep, guttural, and violent sound that did not seem human. He grabbed Max by the collar with incredible, shocking strength. He threw the heavy dog hard against the living room wall. Max cried out in pain. I jumped up, screaming in absolute horror. David stood up, his face twisted in pure, terrifying rage. His eyes were completely red and wild. He did not look at me with love. He looked at me with cold, violent disgust. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door. I sat on the floor, holding my shaking dog. Max licked my tears, completely confused by the sudden violence. I convinced myself that David was just stressed from work. I wanted to believe it was a rare, terrible mistake. But the darkness was only just beginning to unfold. The next morning, I was cleaning David's small home office. I opened a bottom drawer to put away some files. My hands froze completely. Hidden beneath a pile of old papers was a massive, heavy leather muzzle. It was covered in sharp, dangerous metal spikes. A cold chill ran down my entire spine. David absolutely hated muzzles. He always believed they were cruel tools used by abusive owners. He swore he would never put one on Max. Why would the gentlest man in the world buy something so aggressive and violent? I stared at the spiked leather, my mind racing with dark, terrifying questions. The man I loved was hiding a dangerous secret in this quiet house. The peaceful pack was broken. The kind husband was gone, and a dangerous, unpredictable beast was slowly taking his place. Part 2. The Territory of Fear. The atmosphere inside our home quickly became incredibly toxic and suffocating. The warm, happy sunlight was replaced by a heavy, cold tension. David no longer smiled or laughed with me. He spent his time pacing around the house, his jaw clenched tight with invisible, boiling anger. The kind man I married completely vanished into the shadows. He started using harsh, cruel words to insult me every single day. He criticized my cooking, my appearance, and my entire personality. His voice was a sharp weapon designed to cut my heart into tiny, bleeding pieces. I felt completely trapped in a dark territory of pure fear. I walked around the house quietly, trying hard not to make any mistakes. I desperately wanted to fix our broken marriage. But my attempts to show him love only made him angrier and more violent. Max felt the terrifying change more than anyone else. Dogs possess an incredible ability to sense invisible energy. Max started exhibiting very strange, anxious behaviors. He constantly paced the floor and whined softly whenever David was preparing to enter the room. The dog was absolutely terrified. Max was smelling the dangerous, invisible chemical changes happening inside David's brain. The dog knew the violent outbursts were coming long before they actually happened. Max tried to warn me with his sad, anxious eyes. But I was too confused and scared to understand the silent warnings. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I came home early from my office job. The house was completely silent. I called out for Max, but there was no happy barking. I searched the living room and the kitchen. A terrible, sinking feeling formed deep inside my stomach. I walked toward the basement door. I heard a faint, desperate scratching sound coming from the other side. My heart pounded wildly. I unlocked the heavy door and opened it quickly. The basement was completely dark, cold, and smelled like old damp wood. Max was locked inside the pitch-black room. He was shaking violently, crying in pure terror. I dropped to my knees and hugged my frightened dog tightly. Tears of absolute anger burned my eyes. David had intentionally locked an innocent animal in the dark to suffer alone. I heard heavy footsteps behind me. David stood at the top of the basement stairs. He looked down at us with cold, empty eyes. A furious demand for an explanation left my lips. I wanted to know why he was torturing the dog we both loved so much. David did not offer an apology or an excuse. He walked slowly down the stairs, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He raised his hand without any hesitation. A sudden, sharp pain exploded across my face. He struck me hard, knocking me down onto the cold floor. I tasted warm blood in my mouth. My head spun dizzily. I looked up at the man standing over me. There was no regret in his face. There was only a chilling, absolute darkness. The husband I loved was entirely gone. A cold-blooded monster had claimed his body. I held Max tightly against my chest, waiting for the next blow. But David simply turned around and walked back upstairs, leaving us alone in the dark. The territory of fear was fully established. The ultimate, devastating nightmare was rapidly approaching our small, broken family. Part 3. The Night of the Beast. The ultimate tragedy arrived on a night filled with heavy, violent storms. Thunder shook the walls of our small house, and lightning flashed brightly through the windows. The weather perfectly matched the terrifying, chaotic energy building inside David. The final breaking point was extremely close. David paced the living room floor like a trapped, starving predator. He knocked pictures off the walls and kicked the furniture angrily. I sat quietly in the corner, holding Max tightly in my arms. I prayed silently for the terrifying storm inside my house to finally pass. Suddenly, David's eyes focused directly on Max. A wild, unhinged fury twisted his face into a terrifying mask. He reached into the corner of the room and grabbed a heavy, solid wooden baseball bat. My heart stopped completely. The absolute worst nightmare was happening right in front of me. He raised the heavy wooden bat high into the air. He charged across the room, aiming the weapon directly at the corner where we were hiding. I screamed loudly, begging him to stop. I threw my body over my dog, ready to take the fatal blow myself. Max did not try to bite or fight back. The loyal rescue dog simply squeezed his eyes shut and lowered his head, bravely accepting his terrible fate. The deafening sound of wood violently striking a hard surface echoed through the entire house. It was a horrifying, cracking noise. I waited for the crushing pain, but it never came. The heavy bat struck the wooden floor just inches away from Max's trembling paws. Wood splintered and flew across the room. David stood over us, breathing heavily, his chest heaving with extreme, terrifying effort. A cruel, commanding demand for us to leave the house immediately tore from his throat. He grabbed the collar of my shirt violently. He dragged me and my crying dog toward the heavy front door. I struggled and begged, but his physical strength was absolutely impossible to match. He threw us roughly out onto the freezing, wet porch. The cold, heavy rain soaked my clothes instantly. I fell onto the hardwood, holding Max closely. David stood in the doorway, staring down at us. His eyes were completely devoid of any warmth, love, or human compassion. A final, devastating insult was thrown at me through the pouring rain. He declared his absolute disgust for both of us. He stated that he never wanted to see my pathetic face again. The heavy front door slammed shut with a final, echoing boom. The deadbolt clicked loudly. I stood in the freezing rain, banging my cold fists against the solid wooden door. I cried and begged for the man I loved to let us back inside. But the house remained completely dark and silent. The beast had officially cast us out into the cold, dangerous night. I looked down at Max. My brave, loyal dog licked my wet face, trying to comfort my broken heart. I realized I had to protect him. I wiped my angry tears, turned my back on the dark house, and walked away into the storm. I swore a silent oath of eternal hatred. Part 4. The Bitter Survival. 5 long, difficult years passed since that terrible night in the storm. I slowly rebuilt my shattered life from absolute zero. I found a small, safe apartment in a different town. I secured a steady job and focused entirely on healing my deep, painful emotional wounds. I buried my intense hatred for David deep inside my soul. I refused to speak his name or look at old photographs. I convinced myself that he was a cruel, unforgiving monster who deserved a lonely, miserable life. My survival depended on completely erasing him from my reality. My beautiful dog, Max, was my only comfort. He stayed by my side through every dark, lonely night. But despite the passing years, Max never fully recovered from the trauma. The deep psychological bond he shared with his former master was incredibly strong and impossible to break entirely. Every single day, exactly at 6 o'clock in the evening, a heartbreaking ritual occurred. Max would stop playing or eating. He would walk slowly to the front door and sit down patiently. He stared at the wooden door, waiting anxiously for a familiar, loving shadow to return home. It broke my heart to watch my loyal dog wait for a monster. I tried to distract him with toys and treats, but his biological clock was permanently set to David's old schedule. The canine loyalty was far stronger than my human hatred. Max simply could not forget his original pack. One quiet Sunday morning, a loud knock at my apartment door startled me. I opened it to find a local police officer standing in the hallway. He looked serious and held a thin, brown folder. My heart skipped a beat, expecting terrible news about a robbery or an accident. The officer asked to confirm my identity. He slowly revealed the purpose of his visit. He was not there to arrest me. He brought news from a distant, isolated town near the mountains. David was found dead inside a ruined, abandoned cabin deep in the dense woods. The breath completely left my lungs. The man I hated so fiercely for 5 years was finally gone forever. The officer explained that there was no foul play involved. It was a natural, lonely death. Because I was his only emergency contact on file, they needed my signature for the cremation papers. I thanked the officer and closed the door slowly. I slid down the wall, sitting on the floor in absolute shock. I expected to feel a massive wave of happy relief. I expected to feel the sweet satisfaction of karma punishing a violent, abusive man. Instead, a strange, hollow emptiness filled my chest. The hatred I carried for years suddenly felt heavy and completely useless. I looked over at Max. He tilted his head, sensing my emotional confusion. I decided I had to go to the cabin. I needed to see his final, miserable punishment with my own eyes. I packed a small bag and called the dog into the car. We were going on a final journey to close the darkest chapter of our lives. I was ready to face the ghost of the monster. I did not know I was actually driving toward the most devastating truth imaginable. Part 5: The Cabin of Shadows. The drive into the deep mountains took several long hours. The road became rough, narrow, and surrounded by tall, dark pine trees. We finally arrived at the isolated address provided by the police. The small wooden cabin looked incredibly sad, forgotten, and completely ruined by the harsh weather. I stepped out of the car, feeling a cold, bitter wind bite my skin. Max whined softly, sniffing the damp air with great interest. The dog sensed something familiar in this lonely place. I gripped the heavy metal key the police had given me and walked slowly toward the front door. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The air inside the cabin was stale and smelled deeply of strong cleaning chemicals. I stepped into the small living room, expecting to find empty whiskey bottles and the dirty mess of a violent, angry man. But the reality was incredibly bizarre. The cabin was spotlessly clean, but it looked entirely unnatural. There were no glass mirrors hanging on the walls. The corners of the wooden tables and chairs were heavily wrapped in thick, protective foam. Every single piece of furniture was bolted tightly to the floor with massive, heavy metal screws. It did not look like a comfortable, relaxing home. It looked like a secure, padded room in a psychiatric hospital. My heart beat a little faster as I walked down the short, narrow hallway. This was not the environment of a careless, violent abuser. This was a place of extreme, paranoid caution. I reached the closed door of the single bedroom. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The sight inside completely paralyzed my entire body. I could not breathe. The room was not designed for a human being to sleep in peacefully. It was designed to contain a massive, dangerous beast. The walls were reinforced with thick, heavy steel plates. The bed was removed entirely. In the center of the room stood a massive, heavy-duty chain-link cage. The thick metal wire was similar to military fencing. The most terrifying detail was the locking mechanism on the cage door. The heavy steel padlock was located on the inside of the cage. The person using this room did not want to lock someone else inside. They wanted to lock themselves in, completely preventing their own escape. The entire cabin was an elaborate, secure prison built by a desperate man. I walked closer to the metal cage, my hands shaking violently. Deep, terrible scratch marks were carved into the steel bars. Someone had fought a massive, agonizing war inside this small space. The terrifying realization began to form in my mind. David was not hiding from the world. He was hiding the world from himself. He built this isolated, fortified prison to ensure he could never hurt another living soul. My feelings of victorious revenge quickly melted into a deep, freezing ocean of terrifying confusion. I needed to know exactly what kind of demon he was fighting in the dark. Part 6. The Medical Box. I walked out of the terrifying bedroom, desperate for fresh air. Outside the cabin, a dark vehicle pulled into the dirt driveway. A quiet, serious man wearing a medical examiner's jacket stepped out. He carried a small, heavy steel box securely locked with a combination dial. He approached me carefully, confirming my name again. A quiet explanation followed his formal greeting. This box was the only personal item David requested to be delivered directly to me after his death. The examiner handed over a sealed envelope containing the secret combination code. I sat on the wooden porch, my hands trembling as I entered the numbers. The steel lock clicked, and the heavy lid swung open. Inside the box were no letters of apology or hidden money. There was only a thick stack of medical files and dark, clear plastic MRI brain scans. I pulled out the official medical report. The harsh, clinical words leaped off the white paper, striking my heart with impossible force. David was diagnosed with a massive, aggressive malignant tumor located deep inside his frontal lobe. The date on the diagnosis was exactly 5 years ago. The doctor's notes explained the devastating symptoms in horrific detail. The massive tumor completely destroyed the brain's impulse control center. It caused severe, unpredictable neurological seizures accompanied by blind, violent rage and impossible physical strength. It was a terminal condition that modern medicine could not cure or safely control. My entire universe completely shattered in a single second. David was never a cruel, abusive monster. He was a dying, terrified man losing absolute control of his own brain. The violent outbursts, the cruel insults, and the terrifying rage were all caused by the cancer eating his mind. I dug deeper into the steel box and found a small, worn leather journal. It was David's personal diary. I opened the pages to the exact date of that terrible, stormy night. The messy, frantic handwriting revealed the ultimate, heartbreaking truth that destroyed my life completely. A desperate, agonizing confession filled the paper. He wrote about the moment he grabbed the wooden bat. He felt the terrifying, violent seizure taking over his brain. He knew he was about to lose complete physical control. He knew his incredible, sick strength could easily kill us both. He did not swing the bat at Max. In a final, desperate act of absolute willpower, He intentionally forced his arm to strike the wooden floor instead. He deliberately missed the dog. He created the loud, violent noise to scare me completely. He wanted me to believe he was a killer. He wrote about the heavy, spiked leather muzzle I found in the office. He did not buy it for Max. He bought it for himself. He intended to strap it to his own face to prevent his teeth from tearing our flesh during a blind seizure. He was preparing to chain himself like an animal. He intentionally played the role of an evil, unforgiving demon. He deliberately broke my heart and destroyed my trust. He knew it was the only way to force me to run away and never look back. His brutal cruelty was actually the most profound, selfless act of absolute love imaginable. Part 7. Canine Psychology. I dropped the leather journal onto my lap. I leaned forward and sobbed uncontrollably, my tears falling heavily onto the wooden porch. I had spent 5 long years hating the most heroic, selfless man I had ever known. I punished his memory while he suffered in absolute, agonizing isolation. I picked up the journal again, needing to understand the full depth of his massive sacrifice. The following pages contain deep, detailed observations about canine psychology. David wrote extensively about Max's strong pack instincts and his profound, unwavering loyalty to our family. A chilling, logical analysis filled the pages. David knew exactly how a rescue dog's mind worked. He knew that Max viewed our family as his absolute territory and his sacred pack. If David suffered a violent seizure and physically attacked me, Max's protective instincts would instantly, violently activate. The loyal dog would not run away. Max would fiercely defend me against the threat. He would willingly sacrifice his own life to protect his human mother. David realized the devastating, unavoidable consequences of this beautiful canine loyalty. The outcome of a fight would be an absolute tragedy. If Max attacked, David knew his own monstrous, seizure-riven strength would easily crush the dog's body. He would wake up from the blackout to find his beloved pet dead by his own hands. The guilt of murdering his innocent dog would instantly destroy his remaining soul. But there was a second, equally terrifying possibility. If Max successfully defended me by biting David severely, the strict local laws would immediately intervene. The government animal control agencies do not forgive a dog that viciously attacks a human being, regardless of the tragic, medical circumstances. They would seize Max, label him a dangerous, aggressive animal, and legally euthanize him. David understood this cold, legal reality perfectly. In both scenarios, the dog he loved so deeply would die a terrible, violent death. There was absolutely no way to manage the risk safely while living together. To save Max's life and to save me from the trauma of watching it happen, David made the ultimate, agonizing choice. He had to become the villain. He had to extinguish our love with pure, concentrated hatred. He had to force the pack to permanently abandon the sick, dangerous leader. I looked down at Max, who was resting his head gently on my knee. The dog looked up at me with soft, understanding eyes. We survived because David chose to die alone in the dark. He locked himself in a steel cage so we could walk freely in the warm sunlight. The crushing weight of my blind ignorance felt completely unbearable. I abandoned a sick, terrified man to face the darkest monster alone. But the metal box held one more secret. The final chapter of David's incredible sacrifice was still waiting to be discovered in the financial documents hidden at the bottom. Part 8. The Hidden Guardian. I wiped my heavy tears and reached into the bottom of the cold steel box. Beneath the medical files lay a thick stack of official bank statements and legal trust documents. I opened the papers, trying to focus my blurry eyes on the complicated numbers and dates. A profound sense of shock washed over me again. The financial records clearly showed that exactly 5 years ago, David had systematically sold every single valuable asset he owned. He liquidated his retirement accounts, sold his successful small business, and emptied his personal savings completely. He did not use a single penny of that massive fortune to seek expensive medical treatments or hire private nurses. He accepted his terminal diagnosis without fighting the inevitable end. Instead, he transferred the entire sum of money into a highly secure, anonymous legal trust fund. I looked closely at the outgoing payment records of the anonymous trust. My breath caught sharply in my throat. For the past 5 years, this secret fund had been quietly paying all of my major living expenses. It covered my health insurance, my car payments, and every single emergency bill. But the most heartbreaking detail was a specific, dedicated sub-account within the trust. It was explicitly labeled for veterinary care. This fund had secretly paid for all of Max's expensive joint medications, his premium food deliveries, and his routine checkups. The anonymous benefactor was always David. He moved to this ruined, isolated cabin with absolutely nothing. He lived in extreme, punishing poverty. He slept on a thin mattress inside a steel cage, wearing cheap clothes and eating basic rations. He endured the freezing winters and the painful seizures in total, absolute darkness. He chose to live in hell so he could secretly provide us with a comfortable, stress-free life in heaven. He watched over us from the shadows, an invisible guardian angel ensuring his pack was always fed, safe, and completely secure. He never stopped being the leader of our family. I realized the massive depth of my own foolish pride. I thought I was independent and strong. I thought I had survived the trauma by myself. In reality, I was walking on a safe, smooth path paved entirely by the blood, sweat, and ultimate sacrifice of a dying man. I held the bank papers against my chest, crying loud, agonizing sobs. I wanted to travel back in time. I wanted to hold him in the dark and tell him he was a good, brave man. I wanted to stay with him until the very end. But it was far too late. The man was gone, leaving only paper ghosts behind. I felt a cold nose nudge my arm. Max was whining softly, sharing my deep, overwhelming sorrow. I reached into the steel box one last time. There was a tiny, plastic memory card resting in the very corner. Part 9. The last video. The tiny memory card was carefully placed inside a small, clear plastic case. A simple white label was taped to the front. The messy, familiar handwriting spelled out 3 short words, "For Max only." My heart hammered against my ribs. I grabbed my laptop from the car immediately. I sat on the wooden porch, my hands shaking as I inserted the small card into the computer. A single video file appeared on the screen. I clicked play. Max instantly lifted his head. His ears perked up sharply at the slight, crackling sound coming from the small speakers. The video filled the screen. The image was grainy and poorly lit. David appeared on the camera. He looked incredibly frail, thin, and desperately sick. Deep, dark hollows shadowed his kind eyes. He was sitting on the cold floor, surrounded by the heavy metal links of the steel cage. He did not offer a tearful goodbye to me. He did not ask for forgiveness or try to explain his actions. He stared directly into the camera lens with absolute, unwavering focus. He took a deep, painful breath. Then, he made a very specific, sharp clicking sound with his tongue. It was a unique, private training cue. It was the exact sound David always used to grab Max's absolute attention during intense training sessions years ago. Max's entire body tensed instantly. The dog stood up straight, staring intently at the glowing computer screen, recognizing the voice of his true master. David leaned closer to the camera. His voice was incredibly weak, but it carried the firm, unquestionable authority of a pack leader. A quiet, final command left his pale lips. "The mission is officially over, Max. You did a great job protecting her. I relieve you of duty." Dismissed. The super twist of his psychological brilliance exploded in my mind. For 5 long years, Max had suffered from severe anxiety. He waited by the door every night because he believed his protective duty was incomplete. He thought his master was lost, and the pack was fractured. David understood this deep, enduring canine anxiety perfectly. In a rare, lucid moment between violent seizures, he recorded this specific message. He used the exact psychological triggers needed to communicate directly with the dog's instinctual brain. He reached across time and space to release the loyal beast from his heavy burden. Max stared at the frozen image of David on the screen. A profound, visible change washed over the dog's entire body. The rigid tension melted away completely. Max let out a long, quiet sigh of absolute relief. The 5-year wait was finally, permanently over. Max wagged his tail slowly, a gesture of pure, peaceful understanding. He walked in a small circle, lay down comfortably on the wooden porch, and closed his eyes. The invisible chain binding his anxious heart was completely broken. David had freed his loyal friend from beyond the grave. Part 10. The Eternal Pack. I fell to my knees beside Max, wrapping my arms around his warm, golden neck. I cried tears of absolute awe and profound, crushing grief. I had hated a man whose heart was large enough to orchestrate a masterpiece of salvation for his family. He was the greatest man I ever knew. I did not pack my bags and run away from the mountain. I decided to stay. I spent the next 2 days cleaning the small, dusty cabin. I opened the windows wide, letting the fresh, crisp pine air and bright, warm sunlight flood into the dark, sad rooms. I hired a local crew to dismantle the heavy steel cage in the bedroom. I dragged the thick metal chains out into the yard and threw them away. I transformed the terrifying prison back into a place of peace. I erased the darkness and filled the space with light and respect. On the 3rd morning, the sun rose beautifully over the tall mountains. I carried a small, wooden urn containing David's ashes into the backyard. Max walked closely by my side, his steps light and completely free of anxiety. We walked toward a massive, ancient oak tree standing proudly near the woods. I knelt down and gently released the gray ashes into the soft, rich earth. The gentle mountain wind carried them into the green forest. I whispered a quiet, tearful promise to love his memory forever. I promised to forgive myself for not understanding his brilliant, painful disguise. Max stepped forward slowly. He carried something in his mouth. It was an old, worn leather work glove he had found inside the cabin. It smelled faintly of David. Max gently placed the glove directly on top of the fresh earth. It was a soldier's final salute to a fallen commander. We sat together under the large oak tree for a very long time. The forest was peaceful and completely silent. I finally understood the true meaning of a loyal beast. The terrifying monster was never the sickness in David's brain, nor the violent rage that forced us away into the night. The true, unstoppable beast was the wild, crazy, and absolutely ferocious strength of his love. It was a love so incredibly powerful that it willingly destroyed itself to keep us perfectly safe. It was a love that accepted the title of a villain just to ensure our survival in the light. I touched the old leather glove, smiling through my quiet tears. We were not broken anymore. The invisible bonds of our pack were completely restored and stronger than ever. David was gone from this world, but his massive, protective spirit would walk beside us in the shadows forever.